Alright, so this lesson is going to talk about how to reduce a square root that has a negative term underneath the radical sign. And that right there is called the radicand. Okay. Now, the rule that's going to be very important for us to understand is this guy right up here at the top, and I have it on every slide. It's that the square root of a -1 is equal to I. Now that stands for an imaginary number because when you take the square root of a radical of a negative, you get an imaginary number, and that's the definition of the imaginary number. So anything that has an I is an imaginary term. Okay, now if I asked you to reduce off to the side here, no, something completely different, just the square root of 4, you'd write down 2. Very simple. Okay, when you're doing radicals that have a negative underneath, it's going to be very kind of similar. All right, so we have the square root of a -4 right here. Well, that's equal to the square root of a -1 times a +4. All right, fair enough. Okay, so we know two things here. Number one, we know that the square root of a -1, and it's not what I wanted. We know the square root of a -1 is I, as we said up top, and we know that the square root of 4 is 2, as we've done to the right. So in reality, what we have here is actually very simple. Okay, that is equal to 2I. Again, what happened is the square root of 4 turned into the 2, and the square root of -1 turned into I. And that is finished. There's nothing else to do there. So now we look at something like this. In this case, it's the square root of a -6. Okay? We're going to start this problem exactly like we started the last problem. We're going to rewrite this as a -1 times +6. Now, the first part we really can't do anything with. Okay? Or, well, the second part here. We really can't do anything with the square root of a +6. It doesn't reduce. However, what we can do is we can reduce the square root of a -1. Okay? Now that square root of a -1 is going to turn into an I. Fair enough, and that's on the outside. Now underneath, or what's still the radicand, is going to be that 6. Okay? And so our answer is that the square root of a -6, okay, is equal to this guy right here, which is I square root of 6. All right, so this problem, a little bit more involved now than the last two problems. We actually have some reducing to do. Okay, so we're going to start us off with the same exact idea. Square root of a 32 is equal to the square root of -1 times a +32. Okay, fair enough. Now we're going to break a +32 down. Okay, and we're going to use our perfect squares. Okay, you could use 4, but that doesn't go high enough. All right, what we want to do is we want to use 16 and 2, because 16 times 2 is 32. So we're going to do -1 times 16 times 2. Those first two terms are going to break down. Okay, that is going to be equal to 4I. Okay, now that's on the outside of our radical, and unfortunately the 2 didn't get broken down, so it's going to stay underneath. Okay, the 16 turned into the 4, the -1 turned into the I, the 2 was not able to break down and it had to stay underneath. So, as we know, the square root of a -32 is equal to 4I square roots of 2. Okay, last problem here, and it's very similar to the last one. In this case, we have a -3 times the square root of a -125. Okay, and we're going to start off the exact same way. We're going to break down -125. So it's -1 times a +125. And then 125 is perfect square 25 times 5. So -3 times -1 times +25 times 5. All right, fair enough, not a big deal. Okay, now this is how it comes out. We have that -3 still out in front. times. Square root of 25 is equal to 5. Okay, square root of a negative 1 is I. Unfortunately, the square root of 5 has to stay behind, doesn't reduce, so it's still underneath. A negative 3 times a positive 5 is a negative 15. The I comes down, and then square root of 5. And you're finished.